Hi, everybody. So I want to be really clear before we begin. This video is not about whether you like Charlie Kirk or agree with Charlie Kirk, Turning Point, or anyone involved with the situation. This video is about something much bigger, about how psychological operations look when you have lived through one yourself. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of patterns I see, and I'm going to be referring to a video that I have already broken down before by Chase Hughes about how to recognize a psyop or psychological operation. Just a little bit about me. Hi, I'm Maddie, and welcome to the Anti-Alienation Project. I lived through 20 years of being forced to operate under my parents' delusion, aka 20 years of child psychological abuse, which has given me the perspective of not simply recognizing manipulation when it occurs, but having a nervous system that picks up on it before my brain even does. And what I've been noticing with the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination is a pattern that's very old, very documented, very effective, and I haven't really seen anyone break it down in the manner that I'm going to do today. So again, I'm going to be talking about this from my own point of view, having lived in a parent's delusion under a psychological operation for 20 years. And then also I'm going to be bringing in Chase Hughes' video on how to recognize a psyop. I already did a video on his video breaking that down with my life experience. You can go check that out if you want to. But we're going to start today with the Charlie Kirk tpusa, everything going on. So let's start with a psychological operation in general. Psychological operations, as Chase Hughes states in his video, don't start with lies. They start with attention control, emotional overload, and identity pressure. Survivors of coercive control often recognize this faster because we've lived inside of it. So I'm going to analyze the Charlie Kirk assassination and aftermath. And a big disclaimer here, I'm not going to accuse anyone. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm asking important questions that anyone can ask in moments like these. If this were a psyop, if this were a psychological operation, what would it look like? Again, everything I'm about to say is about patterns, not people. I'm not making any claims against tpusa or Eric Kirk. I'm simply asking questions. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to make this a full live stream. It might be way too long. So this might be part one. But we're going to start with what Chase Hughes breaks down as the FATE model for identifying psychological operations and why it works. So FATE is an acronym. I took a lot of notes on his video, and I'm going to link it in the comments and the description. So in the video is called "Every Psyop Will Become Obvious" by YouTuber Chase Hughes. Again, in the video, he uses what's called the FATE model, and it's an acronym for focus, authority, tribe, and emotion. And we're going to go through each one of those and break it down related to the Charlie Kirk assassination and tpusa's actions thereafter. By the way, this is not some fringe psychology. It's actually rooted in behavioral neuroscience and lots of trauma research. So first is the F, which is focus. And when we talk about focus, we're talking about attention hijacking. The human brain can only deeply process one threat at a time. And if you notice me reading, it's because I took a whole bunch of notes. So I'll be using them as a framework. Studies show that fear-based repetition reduces critical thinking by up to 40%. Fear-based repetition. So psyops don't necessarily need to convince you of anything. They need to exhaust you in order to manipulate you into believing whatever they want you to believe. On September 10th, 2025, we certainly noticed disproportionate media coverage patterns. Within hours, I think everyone who was watching the TV or the news or even your phone or computer, you probably noticed that the Charlie Kirk assassination story dominated national headlines far more than any other comparable event that day, or for weeks thereafter, I would even say. I pulled up some stats, but I'm not going to focus on that. I'm just going to talk about the bottom line when it comes to attention hijacking. So attention hijacking, as Chase Hughes describes, is not just about what we see more of, it's also about what quietly disappears. There's a reason why we're seeing more of something and we're seeing less of other things. So this is exactly how attention gets monopolized before we can actually understand what's happened. Immediately after the event at UVU, every news outlet was covering the tragedy. News and media outlets were even repeating similar headlines with a lot of emotionally loaded language. I went through on that date, I did a Google search of all of the headlines on the date where it happened and the following date. So, and I noticed that all of the headlines were immediately framing it as a political assassination. Okay. I thought that was interesting. It's emotionally loaded for sure. And all outlets use consistent labeling saying Charlie Kirk was assassinated, shot, and killed in particular. There are very few variations of the reporting, even though much of the early reporting had very incomplete specifics. There were also memorials, tributes, and special programs on TV announced that appeared within just days before the public had any full investigative transparency. And some might argue that we still don't have any investigative transparency. Second, in the fate model, which is how you can identify psyop again, is authority. So the tactic here is to use borrowed credibility. And what does that mean? Well, trauma research shows that humans are more likely to comply with confident authority figures, even when those authority figures are wrong. This becomes even more relevant during perceived crises. Chase Hughes, in his video, once again, suggests that we notice when authority figures speak outside their expertise. He says that if individuals or organizations leverage their status, their proximity, or their emotional legitimacy, that's a red flag. When people speak with certainty before there is any evidence, and if audience accept the claims because of who is speaking rather than because of what is known. So Chase notes that this call to authority is especially powerful, one, if the authority figure is emotionally salient, i.e., if the authority figure is the spouse or a leader or a symbolic victim. Second, this call to authority is especially powerful when the environment feels dangerous or unstable. And third, it's powerful if media amplification precedes verification. In other words, when our emotions override our logic, our brains tend to outsource judgment to confident authority figures, especially during a perceived threat. I want to talk about tpusa for a moment as a perceived authority figure here. As far as I can tell, tpusa functions as a brand with institutional legitimacy, a perceived proxy for some political insight, moral framing. When tpusa, therefore, speaks immediately after a crisis, their confidence for a lot of people is interpreted as knowledge. And what they state in this moment of high emotion and instability might be seen as fact. I want to review tpusa's first statement made after Charlie Kirk's assassination. So I have it here, and let's pull it up. Okay, I'm just going to read it. It is with a heavy heart that we confirm that Charles James Kirk has been murdered by a gunshot that took place during Turning Point USA's The America Comeback Tour campus event at Utah Valley University on September 10th, 2025. May he be received into the merciful arms of our loving Savior, who suffered and died for Charlie. We ask that everyone keep his family and loved ones in your prayers. We ask that you please respect their privacy and dignity at this time. What I noticed in this initial statement from tpusa, Charlie's organization, is that they're stating here that they are confirming that he has been murdered by a gunshot. Now, keep in mind that this was posted on tpusa's Instagram page the very same day that Charlie died, September 10th. Now, I don't know if you guys have watched any other videos on this topic. There has certainly been no investigation completed by this time, the same day he was killed. No autopsy done that they would have been able to review. I'm not sure exactly how they even would have been able to confirm that he had died by gunshot at all at this point, especially since we have seen evidence now that has indicated that he might have not been even shot by a gun at all. For example, the images of the back of him and how there was no blood at all on the back of him, like no exit wound, potentially. And evidence of his body being covered in burns, as if he had been shocked by some sort of electrical current. I have watched a few of Barron's podcast, and he was talking about microphone explosion theory. I think that seems like it might be plausible. And so when analyzing the appeal to authority, I think it's important to review the facts. That to me is odd that they would come out and state that. And to give them grace, to give them the benefit of the doubt, perhaps they just assumed it was a gunshot. You know, you heard the sound, they saw what they saw, and they may have assumed. But the wording there is that they are confirming it. Now let's keep going. So I also would be remiss if I did not review some of Erica Kirk's post-event speeches, not just because she is his wife, but also because she took on the role of CEO. And I think this is where borrowed credibility and the appeal to authority becomes especially potent. So first, Chase Hughes and many others, specialists in this field of studying psychological operations, they talk a lot about emotional authority and how that supersedes factual authority. So as a spouse, Erica Kirk, she has emotional legitimacy next to her husband, of course. Who would know him better than her? So that can cause audiences to suspend their skepticism automatically, because surely she must have known him the best. Surely she must be telling the truth, because no one would care about the truth and about the facts and about the investigation being handled properly more than his next of kin. That's what we assume. And her grief, especially at the beginning, provided Erica with moral unassailability. In fact, I was looking for people online to confirm how I was feeling about all of her speeches, public speeches, and her behavior. And everybody was saying, everybody grieves differently, kind of putting her off the hook. Now it's been 3-4 months. And finally, videos are starting to show up everywhere about how Erica Kirk's behavior is weird, exposing Erica Kirk. And that's not what I'm here to do. I'm not here to expose Erica Kirk. I'm not saying that this is manipulation by default. It's how humans are wired to respond. But psychologically speaking, emotional authority does override a lot of evidentiary caution. For instance, statements might feel true because challenging them feels wrong or feels immoral. One thing that I noticed in particular was Erica Kirk's speech at Charlie's memorial. I don't know if you guys saw that, but I want to play a clip of her speech and then break it down afterward.
That man, that young man, I forgive him. I forgive him because it was what Christ did and is what Charlie would do.
Okay, let me know in the comments or the chat if you guys saw that live or if you've seen that before and what your response was. Let's talk about it. So, in forgiving that man, that young man, aka Tyler Robinson, Erica is accomplishing a lot, and she's accomplishing more than I think most people realize. She's not just painting herself as really charitable, really forgiving, extremely gracious. I mean, I don't think I could forgive if I were in her position that quickly. But she's also covertly asserting that Tyler Robinson is the killer. In making this statement publicly, in front of thousands of people and online in front of millions of people, she is stating that he is the assassin because she's forgiving him. So he's obviously culpable. Now, keep in mind, even if the media and the news has been making this very same claim, no thorough investigation has been completed by this point. This is 11 days after his death. His memorial was 11 days later. But as Charlie's wife and the CEO of his organization, Erica Kirk, just 11 days after her husband's public and very gruesome assassination, solidifies that Tyler Robinson is who killed her husband. And by the way, she forgives him. Now, if we rewind a bit and review what Chase Hughes suggests in how to recognize a psyop, we can recall that he says to notice when authority figures speak outside of their expertise. He says that if individuals or organizations leverage status, proximity, or emotional legitimacy, speak with certainty before evidentiary clarity exists, or if audience accept the claims because of who is speaking, not because of what is known, these are signs that authority is being leveraged to get the public to believe a lie. Again, I want to be clear. I'm not accusing Erica Kirk of killing her husband. What I'm wondering is how Erica Kirk, just 11 days after her husband's assassination, could possibly have all of the necessary information to make that determination, especially since a thorough investigation has not been completed. Tyler Robinson's trial has not even begun. So even if Erica Kirk personally believes that Tyler Robinson is to blame, as an authority figure speaking on the stage of her husband's memorial to millions of people online, I find it very difficult to understand how she can make this statement so definitively. And that was not it, by the way. I want to play you another clip of her.
Yeah, Egyptian
Do
planes.
you believe that Tyler Robinson murdered your husband?
Yes, I do.
Why do you think it is so hard for so many people to believe that reality?
Because it's too simple. Again, everyone always has to think there's more to the story. Well, sometimes there's not. I've seen the autopsy report. I've seen our case pulled together. I've been in constant contact with her.
Okay, so she said that very quickly, very, very definitively. And I find it difficult to understand how she could make this statement more than once, national television. And she's seeming to forget, or maybe she does remember, but we live in a country where you are presumed innocent until proven guilty. The presumption of innocence is vital for any healthy democracy. And what concerns me from a psychological and sociological perspective is how statements like this can function as powerful, powerful signals to an audience. When someone with an authority, which she certainly has, makes definitive claims before evidence is available, it can shortcut your critical thinking. Also, it generates a rapid consensus, and it puts pressure on other people to adopt the same viewpoint. This is exactly the pattern that we see in rapid compliance, emotional manipulation, etc. Mechanisms that are well documented in psychology. In other words, my focus is not on accusing Erica Kirk or tpusa or anyone at all. It's on understanding how these dynamics play out and why I think it deserves careful attention. That brings me to the T in the fate model. Okay, so we have the F and the A. Now we're at T, stands for tribe, or the us versus them mentality. So when you think of tribal language, this is language like patriots versus traitors, awake versus asleep, good versus evil, us versus them. It's not persuasion, it's polarization. It's very black and white language, and it signals a tribe mentality. It might include language like our side, enemies. This proves what we always said. This proves what we've always believed. Critics argue, supporters say, it's us and them, divided nation, lines drawn, etc. So when analyzing tpusa's public messaging, we have to remember that tpusa already functions as a political identity hub. And it already has a predefined side, which is obviously Republican, conservative, the right. So, which by the way, I consider myself a conservative. So I'm not coming at tpusa at all here from a liberal standpoint. I just wanted to make that clear. It's not like I have an ulterior motive or anything like that. But according to Chase Hughes, again, I took a bunch of notes and went through his video. So that's what I'm using as a framework here. According to him, in moments of crisis, messaging often frames events as confirmation of prior beliefs, places the organization and its audience on the right side of history, while positioning outsiders as hostile or corrupt. So the out group is framed as malicious, evil, dangerous, perhaps even anti-American or even anti-truth. So once you establish an us versus a mentality and that the other side is dangerous, evil, at that point, counter evidence feels like betrayal, and questions to the side that is us and our narrative feel like infiltration. Members of the in group may even start to feel like silence is a safer option than inquiry, skepticism. So the bottom line is that the loudest tribal signals dominate coverage. Okay, so the first instance of tribal speak, obviously I did a lot of research for this video, probably way too much, is Erica Kirk defending her tpusa family, quote unquote. Erica Kirk has explicitly framed Turning Point USA and her closest supporters as her family many, many times. And others on the internet have recognized and commented on this. She has sharply delineated critics as opponents of her family. For instance, Erica said publicly that when critics, quote, go after my family, my Turning Point USA family, my Charlie Kirk Show family, that is when I draw the line, end quote. That's a pretty clear framing, in my opinion, of tpusa as the insiders as the in group and critics as outsiders attacking her family. This is tribal language. This is equating allegiance with familial loyalty, allegiance to her organization as familial loyalty. It's marking critics as aggressors. She has also blamed critics for having what she describes as a mind virus. She has described conspiracy theorists about who've questioned details about her husband's death as a mind virus. This does not dispute specific claims on evidence, by the way, by just saying they have a mind virus instead of responding to each individual claim and question. That is attributing danger or even lunacy to anybody who has questions, anyone who's using their critical thinking skills, positioning them as harmful in a psychological sense. And those of us who have been through any type of psychological manipulation, probably used to the technique of Darvo, which is talked about this before on my channel, especially related to Kirk, actually. It's an acronym that stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. So you deny the allegation, you attack the person who is making the allegation, and then you reverse the victim and offender. You present yourself as a victim, and you claim that the person you've actually hurt is hurting you. It's a crazy making technique, and for whatever reason in our society, people still fall for it. So when I heard her clip of calling everybody having a mind virus that was asking questions, because if you do enough research into Charlie Kirk's assassination, you will notice that a lot of things don't add up, you guys, a lot of things. And I'm not going to go into those details in this video. There are so many questions a lot of people have. And if they took the approach of just answering those questions, I think that would cause people to just stop talking about it. It would answer the questions. But instead, no, they're saying that anyone who asks questions has a mind virus. You're crazy. Don't listen to those guys. They're crazy. So that you're framing critics as not just being wrong, but they're actually infectious or dangerous to the in group. That made me angry. Perhaps most clearly, however, are the examples of tpusa positioning outsiders as hostile and corrupt. Perhaps most clearly, the biggest example is how they have framed Candace Owens' critiques of the whole entire situation. So I'm going to play a clip by Blake Neff. And listen, I don't agree with everything that Candace Owens says or does, and I think she is problematic in her own ways. At the same time, saying that she has a mind virus, saying that she's dangerous and that she, etc., is still a technique worth analyzing. So let's watch this clip.
We wanted to use this segment at the top of this hour to say something important, something very important. For the past 2.5 months, there is a topic that has flooded our Freedom inbox. It has been nonstop on social media, but which we have almost totally avoided on this show. You probably already know what I'm talking about, which shows just how ubiquitous it has been. Ever since Charlie's murder, Candace Owens has leveled a flood of allegations against people at Turning Point USA, people at Turning Point Action, and people who work for this show. She has made them against some of Charlie's closest friends and against some of his most dedicated employees. She has suggested that Michael McCoy, Charlie's chief of staff, knew Charlie would be murdered, was happy that he died, and stayed silent because he was told he would be the next Charlie. She has suggested Michael is not his real name. It is. I have seen his birth certificate myself. She has called it suspicious that Mikey's wife, who works at Turning Point, helped plan the campus tour event where Charlie was murdered, which she didn't, by the way. She doesn't work on campus events. Candace has suggested the Utah Valley University event was unusual and its details suggested a, quote, inside job. She has claimed that foreign aircraft have followed Erica Kirk around the country and that Turning Point has lied about this happening. She has accused us of lying about Charlie wanting Erica to take over for him if he died. She has suggested Charlie's security team intentionally denied him first aid after the shooting to ensure that he died. She has raised suspicions about the head of our technical team because he took an SD card out of a camera. She has spread absurd claims that Tyler Boyer, who we just had on the show, sexually abuses male interns. She has suggested that tpusa faith-affiliated pastors, like theologian Frank Turek, who we'll have on in a moment, and Pastor Rob McCoy, are part of a military, quote, infiltration of Turning Point, either because they are veterans or because they have family members who are. Even if not everyone has been named specifically, though, Candace has effectively tarred everyone here with complicity in Charlie's death by repeatedly saying he was, quote, betrayed by, quote, everyone. She has said Charlie's murder, quote, had to be approved by Charlie's friends, and then suggested those friends might have her murdered too for, quote, knowing the truth. She has made claims of financial impropriety and fraud at Turning Point, adding up into the millions of dollars, which, again, is not true. Charlie made sure the organization was audited by a third party every year. He personally reviewed and he signed off on every expense report, and literally every single bill paid by the organization down to a single United States dollar. We have never missed a 990 deadline. Candace has made other stranger allegations involving French paratroopers in maroon shirts, Egyptian Air Force planes flying out of Provo, Utah, and potential underground assassins traveling through unseen tunnels.
Okay, those lines in particular, when I first saw this clip, I was like, oh gosh, they're not responding to any of her claims with evidence debunking them. They're trying to present all of her claims in a way that make her look crazy. Again, the mind virus issue. And I think that it's worth noting that I did watch a lot of that Candace Owens coverage at the beginning, and then I stopped. But for a while, I noticed she was kind of having the style of like throwing all the spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. Like her investigation was open, and she was leveraging the general public in order to get answers. And I think they're kind of exploiting the fact that a lot of her leads didn't work out by framing it as a way that she's crazy because she's asking all these questions that are actually irrelevant. But it is clear here, I don't think anyone could argue that she is being framed as someone who is destroying them, as someone who is attacking them, as if she's being violent to them. And I've seen most of the early episodes up to this point that this video is made by Blake Neff. What I interpreted it was more of her asking questions, was realizing that things didn't add up and wanting to know the truth. That's what I thought anyway.
At one point in early November, she started wildly throwing suspicion on members of Utah Valley's soccer team for wearing hoodies. I could go on.
He's blowing that one way out of proportion, honestly, just to make her look crazy.
Always something new coming up, and none of it ever pans out because from the start, there has been nothing there. The attacks and allegations from Candace are either lies or they are innuendos thrown around with a total reckless disregard for the truth.
So, something just comes to mind for me when I hear that is that an absolute defense for defamation is the truth. So an absolute defense for lies is simply the truth. If they would just simply tell the truth about all of the allegations, I think people would stop asking questions. Let's move on to the last letter in the acronym of the FATE model. Chase Hughes talks about emotion. This might be the most important one. Emotion acts as the off switch for logic. Scientifically speaking, and you probably know this, strong emotion suppresses the prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that is responsible for reasoning. The prefrontal cortex is basically our higher self, capable of executive functioning like planning, decision-making, responsible for our working memory, our impulse control, our personality, and complex goal-directed behaviors. Now, we can contrast that with our limbic system, our animal reptilian brain, where we have fear, outrage, and moral urgency, which all do the same thing. They override our prefrontal cortex, causing it to shut down. So with heavy use of fear or moral outrage, whenever our fight or flight response is activated, our protective instincts, especially involving children, our nation, or our legacy, by the way, our prefrontal cortex shuts down and we revert back to our more reptilian state. We're in survival mode. So when you have a call for unity through emotion, not clarity or facts, this can be a coercive tactic used in many different environments. Now, when I was analyzing all the responses of tpusa and Erica Kirk since the assassination, I noticed a whole bunch of emotional framing. It almost seemed entirely framed by emotion. And I'm talking about memorials, I'm talking about speeches, public remembrances. Here are some quotes that were used to memorialize Charlie. And this section of my video could be very long, but I'll keep it as short as I can. Quote, "We must fight for a better America where good people can speak truth without fear of a bullet." End quote. Another one is, "There were 1,000 Charlie Kirks created yesterday. The tyrant dies and his rule is over. The martyr dies and his rule begins." This is emotionally charged imagery. Fight, fear of a bullet. Martyrdom, truth. This is not neutral reporting. In most of what I noticed in memorials, speeches, public remembrances, even to this day, it has been a positioning of Charlie as a hero, as a martyr fighting a battle against moral struggle, and that has an effect on our brains, whether we want it to or not, because the brain computes these messages as urgent and existential, not analytical. This language triggers our fight or flight patterns in our brains. In the days following Charlie's death, immediately following his death, the vigils, the memorials, they often emphasized legacy, unity, and protection of shared values. Some other quotes that I found were, "In times of loss, our true strength is found in what brings us together." Back to the tribal language and the in group. Here's another one. "We are the greatest country on the face of the planet. Amazing freedom we have." So there was a collective emotional focus and appeals to national identity. I don't know if you guys noticed this. Let me know if you noticed this, but I also noticed that people even started to talk about the Republican Party and how this event needs to bring the Republican Party together. Like, excuse me, but this man just died in cold blood in front of millions of people, and you're talking about it, and you're trying to leverage it for a political party. So these appeals to national identity and our protective instincts are deep emotional drivers, and it circumvents any uncertainty, doubts, or thoughts or questions that we might have. It encourages quick moral alignment. There were also a lot of deeply emotional responses from just about everyone in the political or public arena. Calls for prayer, graphic imagery, and what really disturbed me, probably more than anything, was what happened with these repeated phrases circulating. And I believe that the motion here is not incidental. I think it was purposeful. I think it was designed to drive engagement and accelerate belief, adherence, and to get people to believe one narrative before the facts could actually stabilize. I'm reviewing here the social media and community response. So we had these, and I don't know, maybe I'm just the only one who noticed this, but these phrases started to circulate. It was weird to me. Like people saying, "We're all Charlie now." No, we're not. We're not. He's gone. We're not all Charlie now. And, this collective grieving, like a piece of my soul died with him. I am Charlie Kirk. Even though these are just individual reactions, they spread fast, and that just shows how quickly audiences absorb and repeat messages, especially when they're really emotionally charged. People are not just expressing grief, they're mirroring the emotions of others, and it's also a sign that they are aligning their identity with that group. So this is a common pattern, and I noticed it for sure after Charlie's death, which is strong emotion spreading fast and everyone starting to feel like they're part of the same story before all the facts are known. I just have to keep emphasizing that. The trial has not even begun. Now, in addition to the fate model, Chase Hughes talks about novelty and timing. He mentions how the brain is wired to respond to sudden change. When something is different or new, our brain pays particular attention to it. And psyops exploit this with shock, urgency, and timing, coincidental timing. The question he encourages people to ask is why now? And what else disappeared from our attention? If you're thinking about it from a biological perspective, unexpected events trigger the amygdala, which is the threat system in our brain, and it prioritizes immediate threats, causing our attention to become laser focused. We narrow our attention. And novelty and urgency appearing together causes the brain to default to this matters right now. It is your sole focus. It is all you can think about and focus on. That, according to Chase Hughes, is why sudden news stories take precedence over ongoing context or other important stories, and why novelty is a powerful psychological lever. So, just to mention a few things that were going on in the news at the same time that basically became non-existent upon Charlie's death were the fires in the Sierra National Forest. It was a really big fire taking down a bunch of giant sequoias. The ongoing global crises with impacts in the Middle East, like Israeli military strikes in Qatar, continued conflict in Gaza, economic stories and issues with the market, like the fact that August inflation reports and expectations for the Federal Reserve to take action were actually due around September 10th and 11th. We also have the U.S. Supreme Court legal actions. The Trump administration was trying to figure out whether they would withhold about $4 billion in foreign aid. However, on September 10th, 2025, the media ecosystem absolutely flipped. While the U.S. Supreme Court made consequential rulings on federal foreign aid and tariffs, and we had these ongoing conflicts, devastation in Gaza, issues that normally dominate national news, these stories were rapidly buried by the emerging new event. So this pattern where sudden novelty squeezes out ongoing issues is exactly how human attention works under stress. This is just how our brains work. We prioritize what's new, urgent, and emotional. Everything else fades in the background. It's also worth mentioning, I think this is really important, not saying that it's related, but it seems important to note that the U.S. finalized a massive $38 billion military aid deal for Israel on September 14th, 2016. And then back on, I'm sorry, I think that was wrong. Ignore that last part. But under a few days, I think it was about a week later that we sent military aid to Israel. That date was wrong. And then in section 3, he talks about cognitive dissonance and microagreements. So one of the most powerful tools in manipulation is a microagreement. If you agree to one small thing, it's easier to get you to buy into bigger and bigger things. So requests for public statements, symbols, posts, slogans, little things. And in that way, a small commitment can influence your identity, and then your identity can influence your behavior. We have a lot of calls to action after Charlie Kirk was assassinated, such as inviting people to agree with Erica that the mission should not end. That's just a baseline, a buy-in. That's simple. It's very, very micro. Just accept the mission. But the idea is that once you accept the mission verbally or emotionally, you've made a small commitment that will shape your identity, and you view yourself as part of the movement. And then maybe down the line, you will make a bigger commitment, like joining a chapter, buying a t-shirt, amplifying the message, etc. A clear example of a microagreement is Charlie instantly being made into a symbol and the quick production of merchandise. This was so gross to me. When you break it down, it gets even worse. So almost immediately, I don't know if you guys noticed this, but tpusa created new products that became pretty clear identity markers. What stuck out to me in particular was the one t-shirt that says, "I am Charlie Kirk." So this is a textbook micro commitment. You're wearing a t-shirt. It's a visible sign of belonging. It's signifying your commitment, and it's literally marking you as Charlie Kirk. Clear sign that you're part of their group. And you might be thinking that's ridiculous. It's just a small act. Maybe it is a small act. You're right. But it has a cumulative identity effect. Once you buy that t-shirt, once you share that t-shirt, wear that t-shirt, you are publicly aligned with this organization. And when you buy in, when you're aligned, that increases your resistance to even considering any contradictive narratives. Again, we also see many calls for action and identity affirmation. In particular, the people in charge of tpusa making a lot of calls in their speeches and their podcasts for young people to get involved, start a tpusa chapter, encouraging young people to continue the mission and agree with them that it's a spiritual battle worth fighting for. In the fourth section of his video, Chase Hughes talks about emotional scripts from evolution. And this goes back to what we were just discussing before about the primitive part of your brain and our wiring. That primitive wiring can be exploited by preying on your fear, basically. If you notice repeated framing around loss of safety, threats to children or future generations, or an existential crisis, national danger, anything like that, that overrides your logic pretty quickly. And why does this matter? Well, because our brains do not distinguish well between direct threats and vicarious threats when the imagery is vivid and emotionally charged. From an evolutionary standpoint, seeing danger to the group that you belong to was often enough to require you to act. Your nervous system responds first. Your logic and your reasoning comes way later, if at all. The loss of safety in particular causes immediate visceral reactions. And clearly, this is a situation where there's a huge loss of safety. And the fact that it was public and filmed means that instantly it was seen by millions of people globally, if not probably hundreds, thousands of millions of people. And so those people also experienced secondhand fear, terror. After loss of safety, the next most powerful emotional script is a threat to children. This could be the future generations, your legacy, the future. Even if no children are physically present, language and framing often drift toward what kind of world are we leaving for our kids? No one is safe anymore. This is not a legacy we need to continue for the future generations. Phrases like this, they activate a tribal instinct, our parental instinct. And evolutionarily speaking, threats to offspring always required immediate and a unified response. No debating, no talking it through, no logic. Immediate unified response. And when that circuit in our brains is activated, everything pretty much collapses into survival mode, into black and white thinking, binary thinking. And in that mode, to question the narrative feels like a danger to the group almost. This is why emotionally charged events so quickly become framed as loyalty tests rather than matters of evidence that you're allowed to critically evaluate. I think now that a few months have passed, people are opening up about evaluating it, and they're more outspoken about asking questions. Third is the threat of existential or national danger. This scales your fear from an individual level to a collective level. And as Chase Hughes describes, this amplification is from moving from a tragic event to a symbolic threat. So it's not just that Charlie Kirk was killed, it's that we are all under attack. Our free speech is under attack. Our political views are under attack. Our spiritual views are under attack. Language shifts from something terrible happened to this important, perhaps, figure, to this changes everything. Our nation is at risk. We're under attack. And the event is no longer processed as an isolated event. It becomes an event becomes a bigger story about identity and survival. Now, if you think about our ancestors, like thousands or hundreds of thousands of years ago, from an evolutionary lens, this does make sense if you think about it. It mirrors ancient conditions. Because in the past, if there was one terrifying event, this often did signal a broader danger. And in the past, our survival did depend on rapid group cohesion. In the past, if you were dissenting, that could definitely fracture legitimate defense, survival. So sometimes our reptilian brain, logic gets shut out when extreme threats attack, and our brain will prioritize emotional certainty over any factual accuracy. And this doesn't mean that people are stupid or malicious. It just means that we are human. And quite honestly, we're operating under firmware that was written tens of thousands of years ago. Firmware in our brains that was not designed to interface with a high definition video and algorithms meant to promote outrage and exploit fear. The takeaway, I think, is that when we can recognize these scripts, it restores our agency. If you can name the mechanism and recognize when it's happening, if you can even recognize in your own life when your prefrontal cortex is being overloaded and you're completely unregulated emotionally, you can start to bring yourself back down and operate from a place of logic, reasoning. And that awareness is key. It's the difference between being an emotional slave to your primitive brain and being able to steer yourself and your life. So section 5, and I'm getting close to the end of my video. I told you guys it was going to be a long one. Follow the incentives. So according to Chase Hughes, one of the most reliable tools in psychological and media analysis is incentive tracking. So we have intentions and we have incentives. And he says not to follow the intentions, but you need to analyze incentives. Intentions are internal and unverifiable. You cannot verify someone's intentions. However, incentives are external. You can observe them and you can measure them. You don't need to prove that anyone planned or wanted an outcome to be able to ask the question, who materially benefits once the emotional shockwave begins? Who materially benefits once the emotional shockwave begins? So, why is outrage so valuable? This might come intuitively to a lot of people, but outrage is uniquely profitable, and actually, because it keeps audiences emotionally activated. It keeps them coming back. It discourages internal criticism because suddenly unity matters more than asking questions. And perhaps most importantly in this case, it can convert passive supporters into active donors. So, this is why, after traumatic public events, organizations often experience sudden fundraising surges, mobilization, expansion. A lot of people join the organization. A lot of people donate. They get money, they get exposure, they get attention, they get media visibility. They strengthen their in-group. They become more direct about defending against their perceived out-group. I'm not saying any of this requires malicious intent, by the way. But following Charlie's assassination, multiple media outlets and actually members of tpusa itself reported significant increases in engagement. Also donations. Maybe you guys can let me know in the chat or the comments how much money they've actually received. But I think it was definitely over $50 million since his death. It's probably way higher than that, actually. So whether one views this as organic support, because it's kind of hard to differentiate whether people began joining in masses or donating way more organically, or whether it's been an opportunistic mobilization of support, you could say. That's not really the core issue here. In psychological operations, apparently the most important question is not who caused this, but who benefits if outrage remains high, and who loses if emotions cool down and facts slow things down. Sustained outrage is actually not neutral at all. And once incentives align with outrage, you can see several predictable dynamics. Moral framing of skepticism, for one thing, as betrayal. Asking questions is suddenly taken as an attack. Having skepticism about anything regarding the organization seen as betrayal. And at this point, the emotional response becomes self-reinforcing. The story no longer needs new information to persist, only continued emotional activation. So, as I mentioned, the fundraising activity definitely increased after Charlie's death, and donations reportedly poured in. There's also a surge of people starting new chapters, joining the organization. So there are a few more. Context shifting. Hughes points out that when a society enters a perceived emergency, the psychological rules change. People, in other words, are willing to accept things in a moment of crisis that they would not otherwise accept. A clear recent example of this is obviously COVID-19. So under conditions of sustained threat, fear, and uncertainty, people were willing to accept measures that would have otherwise triggered widespread resistance under normal circumstances. But in crisis, people become more willing to accept things that they would otherwise never accept, like surveillance, censorship, information control, or extreme rhetoric, curfews, for instance. At the same time, social pressure caused by this perceived emergency might result in less questioning, even more unity, perhaps. And this is where we can notice familiar phrases like, now's not the time, we need to come together. Questioning just helps the enemy. Don't let them win. Don't let it win. And I did notice a lot of this. I even still notice a lot of this with the conservative party, the Republican Party, being divided and saying things like, we need to come together after Charlie Kirk's assassination. And these phrases are signals that the context has shifted to survival. If you take a look at public commentators, for instance, after his death, there was a lot of using existential and even war-based imagery. Some influencers even declared that this is war, literally framing the situation as a fight for survival, rather than a horrific crime requiring an investigation. Others asked, how much political violence are we going to tolerate? And still others framed it as a moment of existential crisis, like our country is coming to an end, we're on the brink of destruction, that type of thing. And war, when you bring in language of war, this is something that Chase Hughes talks about, is that once war language enters the frame, any tolerance that you might have had for even a speck of ambiguity collapses, because war demands allegiance. It's us versus them. You have to pick a side. And that's kind of what has happened. Calls to band together, put differences aside. Which brings me to wonder, why does questioning feel unsafe in moments of crisis? Why do phrases like, this is not the time to ask questions, emerge so predictably after traumatic events? Well, as it turns out, this is not because people are consciously suppressing the facts, but because in moments of crisis, questioning feels destabilizing. It threatens the emotional order at the exact time that people are desperately trying to restore it. And that makes sense to me. So, crisis changes what feels acceptable to say, question, or resist, often long before anyone realizes that the shift has occurred. You can notice this and observe it in retrospect. All right, so section 7 is archetypes. This is pretty clear. I mean, Erica Kirk clearly during the memorial used a lot of elevated spiritual language, and she has done this a lot, calling Charlie a martyr. Now, I don't know if other people, maybe most of the population, accepted this off the bat, didn't think it was odd. I thought it was weird from the get-go. And as it turns out, mythic framing is where the person who died is not just a person anymore, but a heroic spiritual figure. And that's what we saw after Charlie Kirk's death. That is exactly what we saw. Thousands, even tens of thousands of people gathered for his memorial. And the leaders of our country, President Trump, Vice President Vance, other officials, all were referring to him as a martyr, almost like a godlike figure. And I don't care how much you like Charlie Kirk, Maybe he was your idol. Maybe you did look up to him. Using this language is putting him above our shared humanity. And it's actually known as something called rapid mythologizing. Rapid mythologizing, which is something that can transform an individual almost overnight into a larger than life figure, crowding out any nuance or investigation. So I saw this so clearly. And then from the assertion that he is a hero or a martyr comes the belief that he was assassinated for his Christian faith. And then suddenly the statement that his death was an attack on Christians. By the way, even while the official narrative has not been established, even when the facts and the investigation have not been reviewed. But villain archetypes are very common when it comes to psychological operations, and it pushes us into black or white thinking. One of the most powerful storytelling tools is using an archetype. We have the hero, we have the villain, we have the martyr. And in the immediate aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death, many public voices and media outlets and news outlets began referring to him and framing him as a heroic patriot and a martyr. And then they also began to cast anybody who opposed him as a villain responsible for the act. The problem with archetypes in this situation is that it simplifies our reality into very binary roles. And once someone is cast as a hero or cast as a villain, any nuance or critical thinking tends to fade because our brains prefer to have a clear character, a black and white meaning over any ambiguity. That's why early mythologizing can shut down our critical thinking skills. Not because people are irrational, but because archetypes are emotionally satisfying to our brains. They are used as shortcuts for understanding. So we're almost done with this, but the eighth one is the framing and silencing. This is pretty straightforward. Chase Hughes says that if dissent must be discredited, the narrative is fragile. So this is pretty obvious. Labeling critics as evil, insane, dangerous goes back to the mind virus that Erica Kirk was talking about. And the mind virus framing certain questions as not even wrong, not even dangerous, but unhealthy. Crazy. They have also been clear about wanting to end speculation rather than engaging with it or answering questions. And what I have to say, tpusa itself hasn't issued a statement identical to anything that Erica Kirk has said, but there is plenty of evidence that tpusa, the organization itself, has also pushed back against criticism and attempts to discredit the group. Now, I mean, giving them grace, I think any organization would try to clear their name. I think any organization would probably try to defend itself. But I mean, we have very clear examples that are just they're obvious. To me, it's obvious manipulation. For example, tpusa spokesman Andrew Colvett responding when somebody labeled Erica Kirk a grifter, and he said that such criticism is unworthy of a response. He said, "For a critic to call Charlie's widow a grifter is so beneath contempt that it doesn't merit a serious reply." This is a clear example of positioning any critics as illegitimate. And this goes back to Chase Hughes' initial remark that if dissent must be discredited, the narrative is fragile. We have finally our last section from Chase Hughes' video, which is rapid compliance and viral unity. Chase Hughes states that manufactured consensus spreads overnight in regards to how to recognize a psyop. The observed pattern that he points out is near instant unanimity. Oh my God, why can I not pronounce this word? Unanimous. Okay. Near instant, everybody agrees unanimously. There we go. Identical language across platforms and emotional mirroring. So while manufactured consensus spreads overnight, real belief spreads slower. Near instant unanimity often looks like consensus, but it is not the same as deeply held belief. Actually, research shows that emotional content spreads faster than neutral information. And when people see things repeated again and again, and when algorithms amplify high engagement posts, high engagement videos, people tend to assume that others agree. That is why when we see identical language appearing across platforms, it's not necessarily because everybody's opinion has been fully formed. It might be because there is a viral mechanism to conspire to create a rapid consensus that might feel universal. And understanding that difference, the difference between engineered visibility, engineered consensus, and grounded belief is really important. Basically, when we have the fast convergence of public language and virally amplified narratives, it creates the appearance of a total consensus about what the event meant and how we are meant to interpret it. That's not necessarily the truth. I think that the biggest takeaway from all of this is that psychological operations rely on the individuals that are being manipulated remaining unaware of the manipulation. The moment that you realize you're being manipulated, it all falls apart naturally. Just like me as a child growing up in my parents' delusion, I had to remain oblivious for the delusion to remain real. I could not question it. In the same way, psyops rely on people remaining unaware too. I would even argue that the most dangerous psychological operations are built on moral certainty. They feel righteous. The people involved believe they're doing the right thing. And that's the point. An event does not have to be fake to function like a psyop. It doesn't even have to be fully understood yet. What matters is whether the emotional machinery around it begins to override your reflection and your critical thinking. People who have survived coercive control or child psychological abuse or a shared delusional disorder, like myself, often recognize when things are not adding up immediately, or at least faster than the general public. And it's not because we're paranoid, by the way. It's because our nervous systems have been trained by experience to recognize it. It's what is the natural result when you have learned the hard way that manipulation does not always come across as deception. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is just stop, pause long enough to ask yourself why that feeling is there and what it's trying to tell you. I should have said this at the beginning, actually. I'm not telling anybody in this video what to believe. I want to make that clear. I'm also not claiming that this is a psychological operation. The point of this video was to show you what I discovered. And show you that if it were a psychological operation, I think it would look almost exactly like this. And once you understand the pattern, you can start to notice it more quickly in other circumstances. And it's really important to do so because manipulation works only when it is invisible, and it happens every day in a lot of different circumstances. So I hope you guys found this video to be helpful or insightful. I would encourage you to watch the full video about Chase Hughes, and I hope that people can start to notice these mechanisms happening in their everyday life, not just big psychological operations or big events like an assassination. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.